At the company party, the millionaire CEO decided to humiliate the cleaning lady in front of the hired musicians. Pointing to the piano, he laughed. "Play just one note and I'll promote you." Haha. He didn't know it was all a secret test set up by his father. To everyone's shock, the woman sat down and played a classical piece with a perfection that embarrassed the professionals. Before she finished, the CEO's phone rang. It was his father. When he answered, his face turned pale as the voice on the other end said the words that sealed his fate, confirming he had just ruined his career. The Grand Metropolitan Hall of New York breathed opulence that night. The immense, glittering crystal chandeliers poured golden light over the deep red velvet of the seats and the intricate gold leaf detailing that snaked across the walls and box seats. The air vibrated with the murmur of crucial conversations, the clink of champagne flutes, and the soft melody of a chamber orchestra warming up for the main event. At the center of it all, like the gravitational center of his own universe, stood Julian, tall, impeccably dressed in a bespoke tuxedo. He sported a smile practiced to look like it was worth millions. And it was. That night celebrated his ascent. His appointment as the new CEO of the vast corporate conglomerate his father, the legendary Mr. Alistair Vance, had built from nothing. It was the coronation of a lifetime of preparation, the passing of a scepter that represented not just power, but an immense fortune, billions of dollars in assets now under his command. Julian shook hands, nodded to powerful figures of the Manhattan elite, and replied to compliments with calculated modesty. On the surface, he was the picture of success, the heir ready to ascend the throne. Inside, however, a current of anxiety coursed through his veins. His father's words, spoken that morning in the mansion's opulent library, echoed in his mind. "Tonight isn't just a party. Julian, it's your final trial." He had explained that, to assume total, unreserved control, Julian needed to prove he had more than business acumen. He needed to demonstrate character. For this, an anonymous observer would be at the party, evaluating his every gesture, every word, every decision. Someone whose identity would not be revealed, but whose report would define the future of his command over the family's vast assets. The capital he craved depended on a secret assessment. His eyes swept the crowd, analyzing every face. Was it the eagle-eyed Swiss banker whose investment funds could inject even more money into the company? Or perhaps the journalist from that leading financial magazine? Known for her merciless analyses of market leaders, Julian strove to be flawless. He discussed stock market fluctuations with an industrialist, commented on the investment potential of digital assets like Bitcoin with another shoe, and even debated the security of applying part of the wealth in gold. Every interaction was a performance, every handshake a strategic move. He needed to show he was shrewd, powerful, a born leader, worthy of the inheritance promised to him. He felt like the master of this universe, the conductor of this symphony of power and influence. But the truth was, a single dissonant note could ruin everything. The invisible presence of the observer was a sword hanging by a thread over his head, turning the night of celebration into a minefield of judgment. The orchestra paused, and a momentary silence filled the hall, anticipating the speech he would soon deliver. It was in that instant that his eyes, in his relentless search for the hidden evaluator, landed on a discordant figure in the corner of the stage. Near the magnificent black grand piano, gleaming under the spotlights, stood a woman. She wore a simple, grey uniform, her hair pulled back in a functional bun. In her hands, she held not a crystal flute, but a cleaning cloth. It was Helena, one of the custodial staff. She wasn't looking at the crowd or the surrounding luxury. Her eyes were fixed on the piano, with an expression of admiration so profound and genuine that it isolated her from everything else. For a second, the simplicity of the scene felt utterly out of place. Then a wicked, brilliant idea began to form in Julian's mind. A golden opportunity not to impress an investor, but to create a spectacle of power for everyone. He wanted to show who was in charge, who defined everyone's place in this theater. A cruel, smug smile curved his lips. He had found his pawn. From his discreet box seat, positioned like an eagle's nest above the main hall, Mr. Vance watched his son's every move. His eyes, which had seen decades of negotiations and analyzed the character of hundreds of men, were not fooled by the party's glamour. He didn't see the acclaimed CEO. He saw Julian, his boy, now a man he barely recognized. The idea for this test wasn't born of a whim, but of a gnawing concern. Building that fortune, that business empire spanning continents, required more than ambition. It required empathy, the ability to see value in people, not just numbers. He feared Julian, raised amidst wealth he never had to earn, saw the world only as a chessboard and people as disposable pieces. The inheritance he would leave was not just money, it was a legacy, a responsibility, and he needed to know if his son was worthy of it. He saw when Julian's eyes found Helena. A small ripple of hope warmed his chest. Perhaps, just perhaps, Julian would see what he saw, the silent dignity, the soul of an artist contained in a worker's uniform. Vance knew Helena's story. He knew of the stages she had graced, the audiences she had enchanted, and the twist of fate that led her here. Hiring her as the observer was a risk, an unorthodox character test, but he believed true leadership revealed itself in how one treated those who supposedly had nothing to offer. He leaned forward, hands clasped in his lap, his heart beating a little faster. This was the moment. Julian's reaction now would define everything, the future of his life's work, built with sweat and sacrifice, depended on this instant of human interaction. Downstairs, Julian felt the power pulsing in his veins. The idea he'd had was more than brilliant. It was theatrical. It was the kind of display of authority that would solidify his image. He wouldn't just be the heir, he would be the new king, and everyone needed to know it. In his mind, he already saw the scene unfolding, the humble cleaner, him the magnanimous multimillionaire, and an audience witnessing his shrewdness and absolute control over any situation. With a confident smile, he pulled away from the group of guests and walked toward the stage. His steps were firm, echoing on the polished marble. The murmur in the hall diminished, heads turned, and an expectant silence began to settle. All eyes were on him. Helena, meanwhile, remained lost in contemplation. The piano was not just an object to her, it was a portal to a world she thought she had lost forever. The ivory keys, yellowed by time, seemed to whisper stories. She could feel the wood's resonance, the tension of the strings, the soul of the instrument. A wave of melancholy and longing enveloped her. For a brief instant, she forgot the uniform, her role there, the promise she had made to Mr. Vance. It was just her and the music. It was then that a voice, loud and charged, with an arrogance that cut the air like a blade, ripped her from her reverie. Julian's voice echoed through the theater, amplified by the sudden silence, and every word was like a cruel spotlight cast upon her. Julian stopped at the edge of the stage, his body positioned so everyone could see him. He raised a hand, like a maestro about to begin a symphony, and pointed directly at the woman, huddled near the piano. A mocking smile played on his lips as he prepared for the strike. "Hey, you!" he shouted, his voice dripping with condescension, ensuring no one in the hall missed what was coming. "Yes, you, the cleaning lady." Julian's words, "the cleaning lady," hung in the opulent air of the theater, heavy and grotesque. For an instant, the only sound was the distant hum of the air conditioning. The murmurs of the elite ceased. Champagne glasses stopped halfway to their lips. A wave of shock ran through the hall, a collective embarrassment that made many look away, suddenly interested in the architectural details of the ceiling. For Helena, The whole world contracted, funneling into that beam of light that pinned her next to the piano. The heat of the spotlight seemed to intensify, and hundreds of pairs of eyes became needles piercing her skin. The cleaning cloth in her hand felt like it weighed a ton. Her first instinct was to run, to rush into the darkness of the wings, into the anonymous safety of her work, away from this public massacre. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic beat of panic and humiliation. In the box seat, Mr. Vance's hand clamped down on the velvet armrest, his knuckles white. The hope he had felt moments before solidified into a stone of ice in his stomach. He saw the gratuitous cruelty, the need to diminish another to feel great. That wasn't leadership, it was tyranny. He watched Helena's pale face, the way she shrank under the weight of the mockery, and felt a pang of guilt for putting her in that position. He had underestimated Julian's capacity for insensitivity. The future of his business, of all the capital built over a lifetime, suddenly seemed to be in the hands of a stranger, an arrogant man who happened to be his son. He held his breath, watching, praying that Helena would remember the strength she possessed. Julian, however, interpreted the stunned silence of the audience as a sign of admiration for his audacity. He felt like a ringmaster, the director of an impromptu spectacle, demonstrating his power. He stepped forward, widening his smile, reveling in the control he wielded over everyone in that room. To him, this was an investment in his image, a display that he wasn't afraid to break the rules. With a theatrical flourish, he opened his arms in a mocking invitation. "Like the piano?" he asked, his voice now louder, laced with a false generosity that only accentuated the offense. "Come on up here." That was enough to break the spell of embarrassment. Some guests, eager to please the new CEO, let out nervous giggles. The giggles turned into muffled laughter. A chorus of complicity that validated the act of humiliation. The mockery was now explicit, and Helena was at its epicenter. She closed her eyes for a second, seeking refuge within herself. Mr. Vance's words returned to her mind. He needs to be tested not in a boardroom, but on the stage of life. I want to see how he treats those he believes have no power at all. That sentence was her anchor. This wasn't about her. It was about him. With that thought, a cold calm began to spread through her body, extinguishing the panic. She wasn't a victim, she was the evaluator. Helena opened her eyes. The fear was gone, replaced by a silent, unwavering determination. She raised her head, and her gaze didn't meet Julian's, but swept the audience with a dignity that silenced them again. She straightened her shoulders, a subtle gesture that transformed her work uniform into armor. She didn't need to run. She needed to follow the plan. Slowly, deliberately, she tucked the cleaning cloth into her apron pocket. Then, with the poise of a queen walking toward the throne, she took the first step toward the stairs leading to the stage, toward her judge, who barely knew he was the one being judged. Every step Helena took toward the stage was measured and purposeful. The sound of her simple shoes on the wooden floor seemed to echo in the tense silence. A countdown to something inevitable. The laughter had completely ceased, replaced by morbid curiosity. What would this woman do? The audience, comprised of billionaires, investors, and high society figures, was accustomed to grand spectacles, operas and ballets, but this raw, unpredictable scene held their attention in a visceral way. They watched the anonymous grey figure climb the steps, her expression undecipherable. She didn't look frightened or angry. There was a serenity to her countenance that was profoundly unsettling, especially in contrast to Julian's smug smile, which awaited her at center stage like a Roman emperor expecting the arrival of a gladiator. Julian, for his part, felt a wave of euphoria. Everything was going better than planned. The woman was obeying, stepping onto the stage for her public humiliation. He saw her as the personification of all the little people who dared to exist in his world of big business and astronomical figures. To him, A person's value was measured by their net worth, the number of shares they owned, the dividends they received. Someone like Helena, a cleaner, was a cipher in the equation of life. He felt magnanimous granting her this moment under the spotlights, even if it was just to serve as a stepping stone for his own grandeur. This act, he thought, would be remembered as an example of his unshakable confidence, the mark of a leader unafraid of the unconventional. When Helena finally stopped next to the grand piano, a few feet from him, Julian leaned in as if to tell a secret, but kept his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Must be the first time you've seen one up close, eh?" he sneered, and the sound of his voice was like the crack of a whip. The complicit giggles returned, a little louder this time. Cruelty was the entertainment of the night. Helena did not reply. She simply looked at the piano, at the distorted reflection of the theater lights on the polished black lacquer. She smelled the ancient wood, the metal, and the felt. That instrument was no stranger to her. It was an old friend. She ran her fingertips lightly over the closed lid, an intimate, reverent touch that went unnoticed by almost everyone. Julian, impatient with the lack of a subservient reaction, decided to bring his play to a climax. He straightened up, assuming an air of great benefactor. "Let's make a deal," he proclaimed, his voice resonating with false generosity. "Play one note, one correct note, and I'll give you a promotion. Ha ha!" The laughter exploded, loud and forced, and it was the signal for the audience to join in. The hall filled with the sound of guffaws, a wave of derision that crashed against Helena. The humiliation was now a complete performance. They weren't just laughing with Julian, they were laughing at her uniform, her silence, her position, and in the box seat, Mr. Vance's face was a stone mask. Every laugh was a nail in the coffin of the admiration he had once felt for his son. He was witnessing the moral bankruptcy of his heir, the collapse of the character he so valued. And the pain in his chest was as deep as it was silent. The echo of the laughter in the theater was deafening for Helena. It was a raw sound, devoid of humanity, a collective manifestation of power reveling in diminishing the other. She felt naked under the spotlights, exposed not only to mockery, but also to memories she had tried to bury. That sound transported her to another life, to a different stage in Vienna, where the audience had applauded with enthusiasm, not scorn. She remembered the adrenaline before every concert, the feel of the satin of her gowns, the sparkle in the eyes of those who came to hear her. All of it seemed to have happened to someone else, in a time that now dissolved into dust. Her present was the smell of cleaning products, the ache in her back after long hours of work, and the social invisibility her uniform granted her. That stage was a painful reminder of what she had lost, an open wound that Julian's cruelty salted without mercy. As the laughter slowly subsided, Helena took a deep breath, trying to anchor herself in the present. She looked at her hands that had once performed the most complex works of Chopin, Rachmaninoff, and Beethoven, were now calloused and rough from manual labor. An involuntary tremor ran through them. Was it nervousness, or perhaps the contained indignation simmering inside her? Julian, noticing the tremor, let out a louder laugh, convinced his intimidation plan was a complete success. "Look at that," he pointed, like a mean boy on a school playground. "She's shaking. Come on, don't be shy. It's just one key. Even a kid can do it." The audience watched, some now with a certain discomfort beginning to filter beneath the superficial amusement. There was something in Helena's posture, in the way she remained motionless despite the mockery, that began to bother them. It wasn't submission they saw, but silent resistance. Yet no one dared to break the mood imposed by the new CEO. Everyone there had something to gain or lose from Julian's ascent: investments, partnerships, access to the family's capital, all weighed more than empathy for a stranger. The complicit silence was the price they paid to keep their places in the new king's court. "Helena," oblivious to the audience's power games, took a step toward the piano bench. Her movements were slow, almost ritualistic. She felt the soft leather beneath her fingers as she pulled the bench into the correct position. She sat. The height was perfect, a detail that gave her a comforting pang of familiarity. She looked at the keys, a sea of black and white stretching before her. For a second, everything else vanished. The theater, the laughter, Julian, it all faded. Only she and the instrument remained. She raised her right hand, her index finger hovering over middle C. The tremor in her hand increased, visible to all. Julian smiled, triumphant, awaiting the shaky, out-of-tune sound that would seal his victory. Helena closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, and let her finger fall. A single note, clear and resonant, filled the silence of the theater. It was not a hesitant touch, but firm, decisive. The sound propagated through the hall, pure and crystalline, an antithesis to the mockery that preceded it. It was a simple reply, almost a challenge in its clarity. The note hung in the air for a long moment, sustained by the pedal Helena instinctively pressed. It was a sound that carried an unexpected dignity, a small act of rebellion that made Julian's smile falter for a fraction of a second. But he quickly regained composure, ready to deliver the final blow of his cruel joke. "Incredible," he exclaimed, his voice dripping sarcasm, clapping slowly and theatrically. "Absolutely brilliant. You played one note. The promotion is yours as promised. Now," he made a dismissive gesture with his hand, as if shooing an annoying fly, "go back to your bucket. We've had enough fun for today." Julian's order, "Go back to your bucket," was the climactic phrase of his performance. It was the final punctuation mark of his demonstration of power. The moment the pawn would be removed from the board, and the king would remain unchallenged. He turned partially toward the audience, a victorious smile plastered on his face, expecting the wave of applause and laughter that would surely follow. He could already taste the triumph, the admiration of his peers for his audacity and control. In his mind, the scene was complete. The anonymous observer, whoever they were, would have witnessed an unforgettable display of authority. They would have seen a leader who not only commanded but knew how to orchestrate the environment around him, who understood the spectacle of power. But the reaction he expected did not come. The silence that followed his order was different from the previous one. It was not a silence of expectation or embarrassment. It was heavy, dense, charged with an almost palpable tension. All eyes, including Julian's, turned back to the stage, to the figure seated at the piano. Helena did not move. She did not stand up to retrieve her imaginary bucket, did not lower her head in submission. She remained seated, her back straight, her hands resting lightly in her lap. Her gaze, previously lost in the vastness of the keys, was now focused, intense, as if she were communicating with the instrument in a language no one else there comprehended. In the box seat, Mr. Vance's heart leapt. He saw the change. The huddled woman had vanished, and in her place was the artist. He recognized the posture, the controlled breathing, the calm that precedes the storm of a masterful performance. A fragile thread of hope began to weave within him. He leaned in further, his eyes fixed on the scene, barely daring to breathe. His son's humiliation was about to be confronted, not with words, but with something far more powerful. He knew what was coming, and a part of him filled with a dark dread for what Julian was about to face, while another part yearned for the poetic justice about to unfold. Julian felt a pang of irritation. The woman wasn't following the script. Her immobility was an act of defiance, an unacceptable breach of his authority. He opened his mouth to repeat the order, perhaps with more harshness, to force her off the stage and restore order to his spectacle. But before any sound could leave his lips, Helena raised her hands. The tremor had completely disappeared. Now they hovered over the keyboard with the lightness and confidence of a bird about to take flight. She took a deep breath, an almost inaudible sound that seemed to fill the entire theater. And then the world changed. Helena's hands did not touch, they flew. They danced across the keys with a speed and precision that defied logic. It wasn't one note or a simple melody. It was an explosion, a cascade of complex arpeggios, a torrent of powerful chords that erupted from the piano with overwhelming force. The piece was unmistakable to any classical music connoisseur. Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2, one of the most demanding and virtuosic works ever composed for the piano. The sound that filled the theater wasn't just music. It was a force of nature. It was passion, pain, fury, and redemption, all translated into notes that seemed to set the air on fire. The hired orchestra, with its violins and cellos, seemed a pale imitation compared to the richness and power emanating from that single instrument under the fingers of that woman, the cleaning lady. The audience held its breath, collectively, as if a single body. Julian's jaw dropped, the idiotic smile frozen on his face, the arrogance evaporating like mist under a scorching sun. He was paralyzed, witnessing something his mind refused to process. This wasn't a test. It was a judgment, and the judge was the woman he had just humiliated. The music that poured from the piano was not just a melody, it was a force of nature, a storm of emotions that swept through the grand metropolitan hall. Helena's hands, which had been trembling moments before, were now extensions of her soul, moving with a precision and passion that bordered on the supernatural. Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody, in her hands, became a biography. There was the fury of the fast, complex sections, notes that tumbled over each other like years of frustration and contained pain. Then, the deep melancholy of the slower passages, each note a sigh for a glorious past, for abandoned dreams. The sound was 10 times more powerful, cleaner, and more laden with meaning than the entire orchestra. The professional musicians, watching from the wings, exchanged looks of incredulity and reverent admiration. They were witnessing a level of mastery few in the world achieved. Julian remained frozen in the same spot, the arrogance sliding off his face like melting wax. Sweat began to bead on his forehead, trickling down his temples. His tuxedo, which had previously felt like an armor of power, now suffocated him. Every note Helena played was a blow to his ego, a demolition of his reality. His world was built on the certainty of money, the solidity of assets, the measurable power of capital. He understood stocks, cash flow, how to turn capital into more capital. But this was a form of wealth he couldn't buy, control, or even comprehend. It was a power that came from within, pure and undeniable, and his, based on inheritance and intimidation, suddenly seemed fragile and vulgar. He looked at the faces in the audience, searching for a trace of shared mockery, but found none. He found only admiration, astonishment, and deep respect, all directed at the woman he had treated like dirt. In the box seat, a solitary tear escaped Mr. Vance's eyes and slid down his wrinkled cheek. It was not a tear of sadness, but of painful clarity. He understood that a man's true wealth was not listed on the stock exchange, nor kept in Swiss accounts. His entire business empire, his fortune in dollars and euros, seemed insignificant before that demonstration of spiritual richness. Helena's music was not just a performance, it was the final report, the most honest and brutal evaluation he could have received. Every powerful chord denounced Julian's arrogance. Every delicate melody exposed his lack of empathy. In that moment, the decision he had been postponing for years crystallized in his heart with the hardness of a diamond. The future of his legacy was sealed. The music moved toward its climax. Helena was in a trance. her body swaying gently with the intensity of the piece. She was no longer in the theater, no longer a cleaning lady. She was home, in the only place where she had ever been truly free. The final notes of the rhapsody arrived like an avalanche, a series of thundering chords that shook the very foundations of the hall. The last note, a final chord, powerful and absolute, was played with a force that made the entire piano vibrate. And then she lifted her hands from the keys. The sound echoed, reverberating through the hall for a long, endless second. And then silence. A silence so profound, so heavy, that it seemed to have a physical presence. No one coughed. No one moved. No one dared to breathe. All the oxygen in the room seemed to have been consumed by the music. In that absolute vacuum of sound, the spectacle of Julian's humiliation had transformed into something completely different, Helena's apotheosis. And when the last vibration of the last note finally dissipated into the air, the remaining silence was the purest, most overwhelming form of judgment. The silence was a living entity in the theater. It was not the absence of sound, but the overwhelming presence of a moment that had changed everything. Julian felt the weight of 1,000 stares upon him, but none contained the admiration he had sought. Instead, there was a mixture of pity, disdain, and a shock that bordered on horror. The frozen smile on his face finally melted away, replaced by a mask of pale disbelief. His mind, usually so quick to calculate profits and predict market movements, was paralyzed. He tried to find a logical explanation, a way to recontextualize what had just happened. Maybe it was a trick, a setup by his father. But the reality of the music, the passion and virtuosity he had witnessed were undeniable. The woman seated at the piano was not a cleaner. She was a force. And he, in his arrogance, had tried to use a hurricane to extinguish a candle. Helena, for her part, remained immobile, her hands still hovering over the keyboard, the echo of the music vibrating in her bones. The adrenaline of the performance began to give way to profound exhaustion. Playing like that was more than a physical act. It was an act of liberation, of pouring years of pain, longing, and repressed talent into the keys. For those minutes, she was not Helena, the cleaner, but Helena the virtuoso. The world-renowned concert pianist Fate had stolen from her. Looking at the audience now was different. She no longer saw mocking faces, but stunned individuals, forced to confront the superficiality of their own judgments. She felt no triumph, but a kind of melancholy peace. She had revealed herself not out of revenge, but out of the necessity of being true to herself, of honoring the art that was her essence. In the box seat, Mr. Vance reached for his phone. His face was a mixture of sadness over his son's failure and immense pride in Helena's courage. He dialed Julian's number. He knew the conversation that would follow would be the hardest of his life, the culmination of years of worry and disappointment. It wasn't about punishment, but about teaching the harshest, most necessary lesson. The leadership of his empire, the management of a fortune that influenced the lives of thousands of employees and their families, could not be entrusted to someone with such a flawed character. Human capital had always been his greatest asset, and Julian had proven he couldn't recognize its value. The phone began to ring, each chime a death knell for his son's ambitions. Downstairs, the silence was broken. A sharp, electronic sound sliced through the air like a fire alarm. It was Julian's cell phone ringtone. The sound was grotesquely loud in the environment of reverence the music had created. All heads turned to him, the man who had started it all, and was now at the center of a terrible new act of the drama. With a hand trembling uncontrollably, Julian fumbled in his jacket pocket and pulled out the device. The screen glowed intensely in the stage gloom, and the name displayed in bold letters was a verdict even before the sentence. Dad. A shiver of ice ran down Julian's spine. He instinctively raised his eyes toward the dark box seat where his father always sat. But for the first time that night, he saw the silhouette of the old patriarch watching him, immobile as the statue of a judge. The phone kept ringing, an relentless demand he couldn't ignore. Heart hammering in his chest, he answered. Julian's hand trembled so violently he almost dropped the phone. The simple act of swiping the screen to answer the call required immense concentration. He brought the device to his ear, the cold plastic against his sweat-dampened skin. "Father, did you see that?" he stammered, his voice a hoarse whisper that barely came out. It was a stupid, desperate question. He knew his father had seen. The box seat from which the silhouette watched him had a perfect view of the stage. It was the point from which Mr. Vance always watched the plays, analyzing every detail, every nuance, just as he analyzed every detail of his business and, evidently, of his son. In that instant, Julian felt like a child again, caught red-handed doing something terribly wrong, exposed under his father's omniscient and unforgiving gaze. On the other end of the line, there was no immediate reply, just a heavy silence, stretching for seconds that felt like hours. Julian could hear his own breathing, rapid and shallow, and the pounding of blood in his ears. Then his father's voice came. It wasn't loud, but it had a clarity and a coldness that cut the air like steel, and it didn't just come from the phone. Thanks to some peculiar acoustics of the hall or the volume his father intentionally used, the voice also echoed, ghostly and audible, from the box seat, loud enough for people in the front rows to hear every word. "I saw it, Julian." The phrase was simple, devoid of emotion, but carried the weight of a condemnation. Helena, still seated at the piano, heard the words. She didn't look at Julian. Her focus remained on the keyboard, but she felt the change in the atmosphere. The tension was no longer about her or her music. Now, it was entirely concentrated on the family drama unfolding publicly. She felt a pang of compassion for the man who had humiliated her. He wasn't a monster, she realized, but a product of an environment that valued material wealth above all else. A man who had received an inheritance of money, but not of wisdom. Her act had not just been a performance, but also a mirror, and what Julian saw reflected in it was now breaking him. Mr. Vance's voice continued, relentless, each syllable a hammer blow. "I saw you humiliating the consultant I hired for your final trial." The word consultant dropped like a bomb in the middle of the hall. A murmur of shock and understanding ran through the audience. The cleaning lady, the woman he treated as invisible, as an object for his amusement, was the most important person of the night, the key to his future. The irony was so cruel, so perfect, it seemed ripped from a Greek tragedy. Julian's arrogance, his presumption that the observer would be an equal, a member of his exclusive club of multi-millionaires, had been his undoing. He couldn't see value beyond the dollar signs, the bank statements, the profit reports and dividends. Julian felt the floor disappear beneath his feet. The theater lights began to spin. The faces in the audience became indistinct blurs. Reality disintegrated around him. "Consultant?" he repeated, his voice choked, barely recognizing the sound. He looked at Helena, truly looked at her for the first time. He no longer saw a grey uniform, but a woman with unshakable dignity, whose calm terrified him. She didn't smile, didn't show triumph. She just watched him with eyes that seemed to see right through him, exposing all his insecurity and superficiality. In that moment, he understood. He understood the depth of his mistake, the magnitude of his failure. It wasn't about a business deal gone wrong or an investment that didn't yield expected returns. It was about a failure of character, a moral liability that no fortune could cover. The revelation that Helena was the consultant, the secret observer, hung in the air, dense and irrefutable. The audience, previously complicit in the humiliation, now moved away from Julian, as if he carried a contagious disease. Whispers spread through the rows like fire on dry straw. The story assembled itself in everyone's minds. The renowned pianist disguised, the character test, the blind arrogance of the heir. It was a scandal, delicious gossip for some, but for others, especially those whose businesses and investments were tied to Vance Holdings, it was an alarming sign. The stability of that vast fortune depended on the leadership, and the apparent heir had just demonstrated a catastrophic failure of judgment. The value of the company's stocks, in their minds, was already beginning to fluctuate. Julian, meanwhile, was trapped in a lucid nightmare. His father's voice, still echoing from the box seat and the phone, continued its litany of condemnation. "You are arrogant, cruel, and unable to recognize true talent even when it's cleaning your floor." Every adjective was a knife driven deeper. Arrogant, yes, he always had been. He thought it was confidence, a requirement for business. Cruel. He'd never seen himself that way. He thought it was assertiveness, the hardness necessary to win in the corporate world. But now, replaying the scene in his mind, his mocking smile, his loud voice, the pleasure he felt seeing the woman shrink, he couldn't deny it. He had been cruel, and the last part of the accusation was the most devastating, unable to recognize true talent. That was the essence of a good leader. The ability to find and cultivate value where others see none, and he had failed in the most spectacular and public way possible. He looked at Helena again. The image of her sitting at the piano, her hands evoking a storm of sound, superimposed itself over the image of the woman huddled with a cleaning cloth. How could he have been so blind? The answer was simple and humiliating. He only saw what he wanted to see. He saw uniforms, status, bank statements. He judged people by the cover, never bothering to read the content. His world was a caste system based on net worth, and Helena, in her disguise, did not belong to his. And so, to him, she did not exist as a complete human being, only as a prop in his grand stage play. The realization hit him with the force of a punch. He wasn't a leader. He was a snob, a fool who confused price with value. In the box seat, Mr. Vance felt the weight of every word he pronounced. There was a deep pain in his chest, the pain of a father who must amputate a part of himself to save the whole. He loved Julian, but love could not blind him to the truth. For years, he had tried to teach his son about responsibility, about the duty that came with the immense wealth and power they held. He spoke about the importance of employees, business ethics, and a legacy that went beyond material possessions. But none of it seemed to have penetrated the armor of privilege Julian had built around himself. This test had been his last hope, and the result was unequivocal. He needed to protect the company, the thousands of jobs, the future of everything he had built. And for that, he needed to make the hardest decision of his life. He took a deep breath, preparing for the final blow. The pause in Mr. Vance's speech was more terrifying for Julian than any shout. It was a silence charged with deliberation, the silence of a judge pondering the final sentence. The entire theater seemed to hold its breath along with him. Julian felt the blood turn to ice in his veins. The empire he saw as his birthright, the fortune that defined his identity, the power that was the air he breathed, all of it was on the scale, hanging by a thread. He wanted to scream, beg, justify himself, but his throat was closed, paralyzed by shock and shame. For the first time in his life, he was completely powerless, a defendant awaiting the verdict, stripped of all his wealth and status. In that moment, he was not the multimillionaire CEO. He was just the son who had disappointed his father. Helena observed the scene with growing compassion. She remembered her own father, a small-town music teacher who had given her the gift of art. He hadn't left her an inheritance of money, but a legacy of values, discipline, passion, and the belief that beauty could be found in the most unexpected places. She saw in Mr. Vance the pain of a father who, despite all his wealth, had failed to pass on to his son what truly mattered. And she saw in Julian the tragedy of a man who possessed everything but had nothing. The music she had played was not an act of vengeance, but an act of truth. And the truth, she knew, could be both liberating and devastatingly painful. Finally, Mr. Vance's voice sounded again, calm, precise and final. "The promotion you offered her," he began, and an absurd, irrational spark of hope ignited in Julian's chest. Maybe there was a way out, a twist. Perhaps his father was only humiliating him to forgive him later, a tough but non-fatal lesson. But the hope was annihilated by the continuation of the sentence, delivered with a surgeon's coldness. "Is yours." Confusion flooded Julian's face. "His." What did he mean? The phrase made no sense. Mr. Vance then clarified, and every word was a nail, sealing the coffin of Julian's career. "You are promoted to unemployed." The phrase echoed through the theater, clear and unequivocal. The shock was so great that some people in the audience gasped audibly. It wasn't a metaphor, it was a firing, public, brutal, and humiliating. The coronation had become an execution. "Clear out your desk tomorrow," the father continued, his voice without a hint of hesitation. "You failed." Julian felt as if the world had tilted off its axis. The word "failed" reverberated in his mind, repeating endlessly. He, who had never failed at anything, he, who had spent his entire life being groomed for success, being praised for his business intelligence, his ability to increase profitability, to generate profit. He, who understood the cash flow of a multinational conglomerate, but did not understand the soul of an artist. He looked at his hands, the same hands that signed million-dollar contracts, and they seemed to belong to a stranger. His entire life, his entire identity, was tied to the company, the fortune, the family name, and with 3 words, "You are unemployed." His father had ripped it all away from him, leaving an immense and terrifying void. The silence that followed was the sound of his world crumbling. The impact of the words, "You are promoted to unemployed," was absolute. Julian remained on the stage, the phone still pressed against his ear, though the call had already ended. He was a statue of shock, the blood drained from his face, leaving him with a deathly pallor under the theater lights. The murmuring in the audience grew, turning into a buzzing of excited, shocked conversations. The humiliation he had planned for Helena had turned against him with a force 1,000 times greater. He was no longer the center of power, the host of the evening. He was the protagonist of a tragedy, the main spectacle of his own ruin. His gaze wandered, lost, over the sea of faces. He saw pity in some, malicious satisfaction in others, and in many, the cold, calculating assessment of investors who had just witnessed the collapse of a leadership. Helena, feeling her part in the drama was over, made a move to stand up. She did not want to be there for Julian's final disintegration, but when her eyes met his, she saw something that stopped her. Behind the shattered mask of arrogance, there was a primal terror, the vertigo of a man whose world had just been pulverized. There was no more cruelty in his gaze, just a raw, childlike vulnerability. He looked like a lost boy, unable to comprehend the magnitude of his own transgression, and in that moment, compassion overcame any remnant of resentment she might have held. From the box seat, Mr. Vance watched, his heart heavy as lead. This had been the most painful decision of his life, but he knew it was the only correct one. Not just for the company, but perhaps, in the long run, for Julian too. Wealth had isolated him from reality, transforming him into a caricature of a leader. Maybe, just maybe, stripped of everything, he could find something more valuable to build his life on. It was a fragile hope, but it was all he had left as a father. He leaned back in the chair, feeling the weight of his 80 years, and closed his eyes. The sound of the chaos in the main hall, a distant echo of his own inner turmoil. Downstairs, reality began to seep into Julian's shock-induced haze. "Clear out your desk tomorrow." The phrase was a practical and final command. It meant the end of his access, the end of his authority, the end of his identity. He looked around the stage, at the magnificent piano, at the dignified woman seated before it, and everything seemed surreal. He felt like an actor who had forgotten his lines, abandoned on stage after the play ended. His instinct, the programming of a lifetime, was to fight, argue, negotiate. But against what could he fight? He had been judged by a criterion he hadn't even known existed: character. And the proof of his failure was irrefutable. With a slow, robotic movement, he lowered the phone. His gaze met Helena's again. There were no words. What could he say? "I'm sorry." The words seemed pathetically inadequate. The humiliation he had inflicted on her could not be erased with an apology. The damage he had caused himself was irreparable. He took a step back, stumbling slightly, his balance abandoning him along with everything else. The buzzing in the hall seemed to increase in volume, the faces pressing in on him, the whispers becoming accusations. He needed to get out of there. He needed air. He turned, not to the audience, but to the darkness of the wings, and began to walk, each step an admission of defeat, moving away from the light, the glory, and everything he once believed was his. Julian's retreat from the stage was a desolate anticlimax to the drama he himself had created. He did not run. His steps were slow and heavy, like those of a man walking to the gallows. As he disappeared into the darkness of the wings, a vacuum of power was left in its place. The silence in the theater was then broken, not by a whisper, but by a solitary, hesitant sound, a single person clapping. It was a timid sound at first, but it was followed by another, and then another, like the first drops of a rain that turns into a storm. In seconds, the entire Grand Metropolitan Hall was on its feet, erupting in a thunderous ovation. The applause was not for Julian's humiliation, but for Helena's redemption. It was a collective apology, a belated recognition of the talent they had scorned, a celebration of dignity triumphing over arrogance. The sound was deafening, a wave of admiration that washed away the humiliation Helena had suffered in that very spot. She remained by the piano, her heart pounding, not from fear, but from overwhelming emotion. The tears she had held back for so long finally came, silently streaming down her face. They were not tears of sadness, but of catharsis. Every clap was a validation, a piece of her artistic soul being returned to her. She bowed, not in submission, but in a gesture of gratitude to the art that saved her and to the audience that finally saw her for who she truly was. As the ovation continued, a figure moved deliberately through the crowd. Mr. Vance had descended from his box seat and walked toward the stage. People made way for him, their faces a mixture of respect and awe. He ignored the attempts of some executives to speak to him, his eyes fixed on a single point, the woman on the stage. He climbed the steps slowly, the weight of his years and his decisions evident in every stride. As he reached the stage, the applause gradually subsided, turning into a respectful silence as everyone watched the meeting. Mr. Vance stopped in front of Helena. He did not see her as a consultant or a former employee. He saw a world-class artist, a woman of extraordinary strength to whom he owed an apology and immense gratitude. "Ms. Helena," he said, his voice firm but laden with emotion. "There are no words to express my regret for what happened tonight, nor my admiration for your strength and talent. I asked you to evaluate my son's character, and you did so in the most eloquent way possible, without saying a single word." He paused, looking at her hands. "I built a business empire, accumulated a fortune measured in billions. But today, you reminded me that true wealth, the capital that truly matters, and cannot be counted in dollars or euros. It is in the soul, the talent, the dignity. He then extended his hand not for a business handshake, but in a gesture of supplication. The Vance Cultural Foundation finances orchestras and theaters worldwide, but we lack a soul, an artistic vision. I would like to offer you the position of artistic director of our foundation, not as a job, but as an invitation for you to bring your light back to the stages, to inspire others and ensure that true talent is always recognized and nurtured. The offer hung in the air, an act of reparation, an attempt to transform a disastrous ending into a new beginning, turning the company's capital into an investment in art. Helena looked at the old patriarch, seeing the sincere pain in his eyes. She wiped her tears, and a serene smile illuminated her face. "Mr. Vance," she replied, her voice clear and firm, "the music never left me. I was just playing in silence. I accept, not for the promotion or the position, but for the chance to make the music speak louder than the noise of the world." The night that began as the celebration of an heir's rise ended as the rebirth of an artist. The news of Julian's firing and Helena's appointment as artistic director of the foundation spread like wildfire through the city and, within hours, through global financial circles. The story was too good to ignore. The pianist cleaner, the secret test, the public humiliation, and the dramatic reversal. It became a modern parable about arrogance and redemption, about hidden value and the true measure of wealth. The shares of Vance Holdings, which some predicted would plummet, surprisingly stabilized and, within days, began to climb. The market, it seemed, valued a leader who demonstrated a moral compass, who was willing to make difficult decisions, even personal ones, to protect the future and integrity of his legacy. Capital, after all, trusted character. Julian vanished from the spotlights. He cleared out his desk the next morning, as ordered, in an empty office, under the silent gaze of his father's and grandfather's portraits on the wall. For the first time, he felt no pride looking at them, but the overwhelming weight of his own insignificance. Stripped of his title, his power, and unrestricted access to the family money, he was forced to confront the man in the mirror. The journey that followed was long and arduous. He spent months in seclusion, far from the yachts, the fine dining, and the social circles that had once defined his existence. He traveled, not to five-star resorts, but to places where his fortune meant nothing. He worked with his own hands, anonymously, on charity projects that his family's foundation financed, but which he had never bothered to visit. Slowly, painfully, the veneer of arrogance began to crack, revealing the insecurity and emptiness beneath. He began to learn the value of a dollar earned through sweat, the dignity of honest labor, and the wealth of genuine human connection. Helena, for her part, flourished. She embraced her new role with the same passion with which she played the piano. She traveled the world, no longer to clean the stages, but to command them. She used the vast resources of the foundation not to promote the grandiose and the already established, but to find hidden talent in forgotten places. She created scholarship programs for musicians from underserved communities, financed youth orchestras in developing countries, and initiated projects that brought classical music to public schools and hospitals. She became an advocate for the idea that talent has no social class or zip code. And every once in a while, when nostalgia struck, she would sit at the piano herself on a stage, not for a billionaire gala, but for an audience of children or seniors, and played with soul, reminding everyone that the deepest beauty is often the unseen one. Years later, in a small concert hall in a modest neighborhood, Helena prepared to introduce a young pianist, a prodigy she had discovered in an orphanage. As she adjusted the microphone, her eyes swept the small audience, and then she saw him. In the back row, almost hidden in the gloom, sat Julian. He wasn't wearing an expensive tuxedo, but simple clothes, There was no arrogance in his posture, but a quietude, a humility that made him almost unrecognizable. Their eyes met for a brief instant across the room. He did not smile, but gave a slight, respectful nod of his head. Helena returned the gesture. There was no more pain or resentment, just the silent recognition of two souls who had been transformed by a single night. He had failed in his test, but in the process had found the path to his true redemption. And she, who had been humiliated, had found her loudest voice.